Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 50th week of 2013. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are Ron Szoke, who has fans in Moscow, and David Green, who's running for Congress in the 13th Congressional District of Illinois. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the 20 years we've been on the air. And we devoted last week's program to Chomsky just before a piece appeared in the New York Times by the irascible Stanley Fish, a critic of the New School, and observer of Chomsky's lectures at Columbia, 3 important lectures at Columbia that Chomsky gave last week, and we'll have more to say about that as the day goes on. Chomsky said that in the American media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and it will sound like it's from Neptune. And we are devoted to trying to say something true. And this week we're going to use as our basis a couple of articles, indeed a book, by the redoubtable Perry Anderson. Perry Anderson, who is in his mid-70s now, is a Brit who founded the New Left Review, or rather was the first long-term editor of the New Left Review, the leading sort of 60s political journal in Britain. He returned for a brief stint a dozen years ago and edited the journal for a couple of years more, in which he illustrated Antonio Gramsci's remark about pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Anderson has written about Gramsci, and the position ascribed to Gramsci is clearly Anderson's own. The articles we are going to talk about today appear in the current issue of the New Left Review. The New Left Review, which continues to publish some of the most distinguished writing on the left available in the English-speaking world. This issue is devoted entirely to two articles by Anderson on American foreign policy and its thinkers. The first article is entitled Imperium, Empire in Latin, about what the U.S. has done in the years since the Second World War in the world at large. The second article is called Consilium, Latin for advice, which is a remarkably acerbic survey of what leading American writers, leading American intellectuals have written about American foreign policy and American strategic planning. It's a remarkable enterprise, and based, as Anderson often is, on his having read everything, and it's impressive. But it's even more impressive for what it says and what it suggests about American policy, and as usual, what's not being said about American policy. There's a line in the middle of the second article that catches Anderson's particular style. They taught Perry Latin and Greek at too young an age, and his style is remarkably erudite, so much so that he sends most of his readers to the dictionary several times in the course of one of his articles. But it also gives him a clarity, a lucidity, a balance that's almost Gibbonian. I mean, you'd think you're reading a contemporary author, a contemporary piece by the author of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. It's a remarkable way of writing that depends upon his vast reading and his gift. I think you have to call it that for expression. But here's a line from the second article that illustrates both his ideas and his peculiar style. He's writing about the American author Michael Mandelbaum. He says, Mandelbaum's writing is the most strident version of a Wilsonian creed, referring to Woodrow Wilson, since the end of the Cold War. But in two respects, it is not the purest. Of its nature, this is the tradition with the highest quotient of adulteration, the most unequivocally apologetic in the canon of American foreign policy, and by the same token, as the closest to ideology tout court, the most central to officialdom. Now, if you unpack that lovely sentence, what you find there is saying this is propaganda. The crucial word is adulteration, which if you don't know, you might guess at if you remember your high school Latin, and dulcor means sweet. The quotient of adulteration that Anderson finds in this particular writing means sweetening, means what we've called on other occasions covering sin with smooth names. It means propaganda. And what he does here is beautifully describe the propagandistic exercise of American intellectuals writing about foreign policy without ever once, I think, using the word propaganda. Instead, we get a quotient of adulteration. A quotient of adulteration. I thought first of James Bond, shows you where, Quantum of Solace or whatever it was, you don't know. Quotient of adulteration. It's not James Bond. I had just read an article in the British Medical Journal by a group of British doctors who went through the James Bond books, Ian Fleming's novels from 50 years ago, and said that anyone who drank as much as James Bond is pictured as drinking in his novels would be, I quote, an impotent drunkard. That seems to me worthwhile, having been introduced to the James Bond novel by people in the Kennedy administration as saying, here's a wonderful account of this new world we're fashioning. It seems to me quite appropriate that James Bond should turn up in association with Perry Anderson's analysis, and that he should turn up as an impotent lush, according to the British doctors. So, a quotient of adulteration. You're listening to news from Neptune, the quotient of adulteration edition, and we'll start with David Green's reflections on Perry Anderson.
Yes, a lot to say, but I'm going to try to just be relatively brief and make a few responses to what you've said and what these articles say. I think the intro is really good in terms of what it is I want to say. Michael Mandelbaum is an associate of Thomas Friedman, and yes. I've been meaning to inform News from Neptune readers that I'm off Thomas Friedman, and I haven't read him for months, and it's been good. I feel much better. Life is better. Food tastes better.
On the Friedman wagon.
My blood pressure's down. I mean, you read Thomas Friedman because it's so stupid. Not partly because it's so stupid, but partly because you understand that you know what are now referred to in Washington as the very serious people read Thomas Friedman and try to understand the world in pretty much in terms of the concepts that Friedman lays down in terms of what America is about in the world. And so Perry Anderson has done us a great service. First of all, you don't have to read the books of the people that he writes about, Michael Mandelbaum, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Robert Kagan, etc., and try to take them seriously. You can read Perry Anderson and so you can learn how to think about the voluminous volumes that these people are writing in terms of your understanding of the history of U.S. foreign policy and the apologists for U.S. foreign policy. I do a lot of reading, but I don't read foreign affairs. I don't read foreignpolicy.com website. There may be some decent stuff, and I would learn a lot by doing it. But what I know is that by doing that, I'm accepting assumptions about the world that I don't want to accept and that aren't helpful in understanding. Therefore, I read instead people like Noam Chomsky and Gabriel Kolko and Emmanuel Wallerstein and other people who don't confuse you and don't stress you out by having to interpret everything that they say within the context of the American propaganda, there's that word again, way of looking at the world. So I think that Perry Anderson did very clearly, and as you say, sort of by taking this stuff a lot more seriously than it really deserves to be taken, he helps us make sense of the relationship between these people and what they're saying and the relationship to power. After all, they're not trying to really explain to us how the world works. They're trying to explain to us how they think the world is given on what our leaders are doing. And of course, the bottom line is what our leaders are doing is ruling the world in the only way that it can be ruled. American empire is T-I-N-A, Tina. There is no alternative. There has, since World War II, been no alternative to this American global empire. And so the only questions that arise are the best ways to manage it. And so these aren't really, these are you've got foreign policy historians, you've got diplomatic historians, some of which are informative and do some halfway decent, respectable work, at least telling you the facts of the matter. But beyond this, you've got this whole layer of people who interpret what these limited diplomatic historians do and explain to us in a way of helping us understand where we've come from and where we're going. Now, I just wanted to mention before I sort of throw this open, I think the question that Ron raises often on this program of motive and how we deal with motive, it is an important one in this context. It isn't as if, we're not talking about people who ascribe a whole lot to the motives of the leaders of this country. And so what are at a kind of individual level? But we're talking about American history as having a kind of motive, that the motive is this providential motive, this godly motive, this motive of bring democracy to the world. So we're explaining these things to us on the basis of what we feel that the kind of national motive should be, as if there is this kind of national motive. And the main two options for understanding this national motive of we're entering the world to bring freedom and truth and justice to the rest of the world, and the question is, how much force should we really use in doing that? Given that that's absolutely true, how many people should we kill in order to bring democracy to the world? And then those are people that have generally been called idealists in the context of American history. And you go back to in the last century to Woodrow Wilson and what leads out of Wilson, and Anderson does a good job of talking about that. And then the alternative way of looking at that is there are these realist people who believe that we're really not all that great, but still we have to rule the world. We have to rule the world in the interest of global capital, meaning the multinational corporations that are based in this country and their allies around the world, and just how much lip service do we have to pay to virtue before we get on with what needs to be done. And so it's for this reason, and it's within these narrow boundaries of discourse that would make it difficult for me to read articles in journals like Foreign Affairs, the main journal of the American foreign policy establishment, coming out of the Foreign Affairs Council. But what I think the question that Anderson raises is for people like me, why is it important to understand what these people are thinking? Why is it important for people to understand these people that are propagandists for U.S. power, that they're thinking? And in spite of being well informed and fascinated by what Anderson has to say, we go back to the main project of trying to understand what is going on. And for that, you know, you need Chomsky. For that, you need the recent book that I've mentioned on this program a few times, The Making of Global Capitalism by Panitch and Gindin. You need to go back to William Appleman Williams and Gabriel Coco. So Anderson has taken the curtain away from U.S. foreign policy and exposed it for what it really is. Described it in this first part of this book as to what exactly has gone on, and then in the second part of it, how these people have rationalized what's going on. And so I guess the question may be, what's his motive? You know, not that I want to get into motives, Ron, but the motive issue keeps coming forth here. How do we drive a stake through the heart of this idea that U.S. foreign policy, beyond the leaders of capital, has a motive? So that's, you know, that's my sort of opening comment to throw at you guys for proceeding further with this, and however you wish.
Thank you, David. You have an immediate response to the opening comment, Ron?
Well, yeah. First, I think my comments about motives have been misunderstood. I think it's an essential element of
Why have we done that? What's our motive? Sorry.
Trying to ascribe any meaning to social action. There's an old argument going back to late 19th century, Dilthey and the others, about the extent to which we must have an interpretive social science. A purely behavioral one becomes completely meaningless. And so I'm just constantly urging people to be very careful. It's essentially a metaphysical thesis when you attribute a motive or an intention to someone, because it's never available for inspection and experimentation and having any positive knowledge about. But in order to even to describe in the initial stage what's going on, what people are doing, you need to have some reference to what is meaningful to them. And what their motives and intentions really are, because without that, what they're doing remains completely unintelligible. But I'm just saying, in doing it, be extremely careful, and because you're probably not thinking their thoughts, which is what exactly some historians, philosophical historians, have said we must do, like Robin Collingwood. We must try to rethink the thoughts of the historical actors and understand at all what they were up to. And that is, seems to be both essential and very dangerous, because they're proceeding out of a different worldview, a different set of assumptions, especially dealing with the ancients, that it's just totally foreign to us. And it tends to make one despair about whether we can ever really understand what the Greeks and the Romans were up to. But we have to do it in their terms, and which we cannot recreate in our own minds, it seems to me. But we can always make the effort and try to understand what they did, because in the terms in which they thought about it. And can we recreate their thoughts and think again what they were thinking when they were doing these things? Well, probably not, but we have to keep making the attempt. And that's why there are always new interpretations of history. I mean, why isn't it written once for all definitively? Because people keep coming back to it and getting new insights about what was going on. And since Marx and Freud, we've become very suspicious about whether people really understand their own motives. And so it's helpful sometimes to ask people why they did what they did. But that's never the last word. It's only the first. And there may be other impulses, motives, intentions operative underneath that. And again, that seems to me inevitable. It's something that has to be faced. But at the same time, it's extremely dangerous, because there's always this tendency to read our own assumptions into the thoughts and actions of other people, and trying to model their actions on what we think about ourselves and what we would be doing in that case. This infects anthropology, theology, and so on. And there's an argument that's been going on in anthropology and theology to some extent about how can we understand other cultures or the gods, for example, only by using our own mental processes as the model for what's going on. And sometimes it's not a bad one. Some of the anthropologists say, in dealing with anthropomorphism in religion, it's the best available model we have for understanding God's action in the world. And but again, that may be indispensable in some cases, but it's highly dangerous for anyone who really seeks the truth.
Our task here is to discuss the news of the week and its coverage by the media, and we're suggesting that in order to do that, we have to put it ever more carefully into the context of the history, certainly the history of our lifetimes, the history of what the United States government has done in the world since the Second World War, which is what Perry Anderson is talking about here, and the interpretation of that by America's own apologists, by those academics and writers and journalists who are telling us what the U.S. is doing and what the U.S. should do. And much of this is whole cloth. And what Perry Anderson shows us, it seems to me, in his account, first of all, of what the U.S. has done in the last 2 generations, and then in his account of how that has been interpreted and projected by American intellectuals, is to show us what intellectual Potemkin village American foreign policy writing really is. I mean, what a fantasy land it is. In fact, it's interesting to read what Anderson has to say about these writers, and he does a remarkable job of surveying. I'm reading all those people that David said he wouldn't want to read, and I quite understand that. It's amazing that Anderson does that. He does a second thing quite well, too. He summarizes them with a remarkable degree of I want to say accuracy, because I think it is accurate, but what I mean to say is that his summary does not involve his interpretation except in an unavoidable ironic overtone on occasion. I mean, the summaries are pretty straight, and that's really interesting and difficult. Now, in this, and it's a good place for us to start then, to try to talk about what it is we really want to talk about, what the United States is doing in the context of what it has done, and where it's going from here. And that's why it seems to me these are particularly valuable. The story is, in fact, not really that complex. 15 years ago, Noam Chomsky wrote in a brief, or said in a brief talk, I'm quoting, "I've been asked to speak about the great powers and human rights." That's actually a very brief talk. There are 2 versions of the story. The official one is familiar. Upholding human rights is our highest goal, even the soul of our foreign policy, as President Carter put it. And if we are at all at fault, it is in maintaining this noble standard too rigorously, to the detriment of the famous national interest. A second version is given, and by the way, what Chomsky was saying there, that's a 1-sentence summary of what Anderson's second article does and analyzes. A second version, that is an account of the great powers and human rights, is given by the events of history and the internal record of planning. That's which Anderson's first article is devoted to. It was outlined with admirable frankness in an important state paper of 1948, PPS 23, written by one of the architects of the New World Order of the day, the head of the State Department Policy Planning Staff, the respected statesman and scholar George Kennan. And a lot of Anderson's account in the first article is based on a recent intellectual biography of Kennan. In the course of because of his importance, not just because he was an interesting guy, in the course of assigning each region of the world its proper role within the overarching framework of American power, this is Kennan writing in the late 1940s, he observed that the basic policy goal is to maintain the position of disparity that separates our enormous wealth from the poverty of others. And to achieve that goal, quote, we should cease to talk about vague and unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of the living standards, and democratization, recognizing that we must deal in straight power concepts, not hampered by idealistic slogans about altruism and world benefaction. Close quote. Now, this was a top secret memorandum in the American government in 1948, but what it sets out is the real world that is being, whose sins are being covered with smooth names by the authors that Anderson treats in the second article. And it seems to me that that's a task, consummation worthy to be produced. We should indeed do precisely that. That's why I recommend these articles, difficult as they are. They're not the easiest reads in the world. You're listening to News from Neptune, the Quotient of Adulteration edition, devoted to Perry Anderson's account of American foreign policy. Ron, you've got some comments to make on this?
I think Perry Anderson does something very valuable. In the beginning of this, my printer gave out, and I couldn't read all this stuff off the screen.
And there's a lot of it.
Yeah, right. So I just, I'm dealing only with the first part of his very long, like, what is it, 60, 80 pages?
This is a book, yeah.
Pair of articles. But he touches upon and asks us to think about the long-running conflict between American values and American interests. And we love to talk about our values of freedom, democracy, and human rights. At the same time, we have certain interests abroad that have to be protected and advanced. And these create an enormous inner-tension in American thinking about foreign policy and intervention, military intervention, and the like. So he talks a good deal about the Wilsonian foreign policy, which was hung up on this same dilemma, supposedly making the world safe for democracy. And Woodrow Wilson had this enormous problem with what I would call Presbyterian self-righteousness. So we were going to reform the world.
It's not praise of Presbyterianism, is it?
No, no. No. And
there goes our Presbyterian viewers.
Exactly. Another demographic shot to hell.
Right. Well, and then he mentions Whig history, which I only know about in the context of what Herbert Butterfield has said about it. What do you think Whig history is, Carl? You're the only certified historian.
I'm certified, believe me.
Right.
I got the certification. The Whig history, I think, is used as a notion that things are getting better. We're improving. Progressivism is progressing along nicely, thank you. Liberal, it's a liberal view of history. To use liberal to gloss Whig is clearly stupid, because liberal is one of the few words that's more misused and variously used, perhaps. But a Whig interpretation refers to originally the British political party, so to speak, that we would, in one sense, call liberal, and the notion that the reformist approach to society can produce good results and is doing so. Reform is winning. That's the Whig interpretation of history in a bold phrase.
Yeah, well, history is proceeding in a certain direction, and it's a favorable direction.
Exactly.
I think is the idea.
Right.
So Anderson talks then about a number of these things. These, at one level, are dilemmas. Others are just tensions, inner tensions in our thinking, which then erupt in various ways and in various forms in all of the talk about American foreign policy and imperialism and militarism and so on. So the USA, according to many of these thinkers, has taken over the role that was originally set forth by the United Nations, the League of Nations, and then the United Nations. And so we have become the uncredited United Nations, because we are going to harmonize and police the rest of the world. So he mentions that late in the Roosevelt administration, Roosevelt accepted, apparently, the the four policemen of the post-war world. Apparently, that made me think immediately of the four horsemen of the
Exactly.
apocalypse.
Yes. That's the parallel is too close, isn't it? Yeah.
Right. Those four policemen were to be the USA, of course, predominant above all, USSR, the UK, and China, curiously. But
He was assuming the Chiang Kai-shek would
Exactly.
be governed by
Exactly.
China.
Right. He didn't have Mao in mind.
No, exactly. Yes. So he sets out a lot of these, what I would call inner tensions in our thinking. We were going to become the advocates of hegemony, not empire, making big distinction there. Then we have this problem of exceptionalism versus universalism, which tend to conflict. We hear constantly about American exceptionalism, that all the generalizations and norms and so on ordinarily apply to all of the nations, don't apply to us, because we are this new thing in the world, the light to the nations. We are the empire for liberty, the essentially the messianic nation. So it's not a individual messiah anymore, that it's a collective messiah, and that's us, Americans.
C'est moi.
Yeah. Separatism versus messianic activism, or what he elsewhere calls redemptive interventionism. This leads into our current dilemmas about duty to protect and should we be fighting in Syria and so on. And we can't seem to get our heads on straight about that. But there's a lot of conflict. So we have this internal problem of idealism versus realism, and a particularly Hobbesian view of realism, the war of all against all, or idealism. We're going to make the world safe for democracy, freedom, and human rights, and bestow it on other people, whether they like it or not.
Exactly.
And this thing erupted then during the Bush administration among some of our neocon thinkers, that you don't really believe in your values unless you're willing to impose them on everyone else. What do you think of that? You don't really believe in freedom, democracy, and human rights unless you're willing to impose them on all the rest of the world with as much force as may be necessary.
And in the process, killing a lot of people.
Yes,
Right.
right.
Unavoidable necessity.
Yeah.
We had to destroy the village in order to save it.
Yep.
I think you're right, Ron. I think that the theme of the two lines that Anderson pursues here sort of resolves into two themes that he calls at various times Wilsonian and Rooseveltian, referring to the first Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt. Wilsonian values and Rooseveltian interests at war in American foreign policy is the sort of framework that the thinkers he's analyzing use. It's a very strange, narrow, and ideologized framework, after all. The notion that President Woodrow Wilson stood for values is a historical joke of a great order. This is a wretched man who had full of, how did you put it, Ron, Presbyterian self-righteousness and his public statements, but who actually did everything from resegregating the federal government. We sometimes think that segregation, or the movement from segregation to inclusion, runs a straight line roughly from the Civil War to the contemporary world. In America, that's quite false. The advances in race relations, to use a modern phrase, that had been achieved by the end of the 19th century were reversed in the Wilson administration, consciously and purposely, by Wilson, a nasty racist to the first order. That was his government. What his motive was, Ron, I'll leave you, but that's what his government did. And it raised great questions about values. If you mentioned before General Smedley's butler's account of how he was a gangster for capitalism. We haven't mentioned the fact that he was a gangster for capitalism normally during the Wilson administration. administration, and it was the Wilson administration that sent him off to be a gangster for capitalism, particularly in the Caribbean and in Latin America. So the mythology that Wilson stood for values is just that. It's a mythology that's useful in the fantasy world of American foreign policy writing. On the other side, the notion that Theodore Roosevelt stood for realism, that is the real interests of the United States, has the corresponding problem of whose interests are we talking about?
Yeah.
The national interest, as David and you both have pointed out at various times recently on the show, is one of the most deceptive phrases in American political discourse. By the national interest, more and more of us are coming to realize we usually mean the straight economic interests of the 1%. Or the fraction of the 1%. It's the national interest that has to be maintained, that has to be protected by American imperialism in the Middle East, has little to do with interests that you or I or we have, and a great deal to do with the interests that, that Wall Street and the American elite, economic elite, have. That's the national interest, and it was true even in Roosevelt's time, in Teddy Roosevelt's time. That's what he was talking about. So when we begin to talk about idealism, Wilsonian idealism versus TR's realism, and it is that interaction that Anderson analyzes in American foreign policy writers, we realize that we're already dealing with ideological constructs of the first order, fantasies that should be recognized as such. David, I wanted to ask you about one particular starting point for Anderson in his second article. He takes a quite remarkable book, or set of books rather, by Walter Russell Mead. Don't I remember that you had a dialogue with Walter Russell Mead some years ago?
Somehow that got, I tried to look that up, but it got lost in my email, and I can't even remember what it was. It kind of went down the memory hole. And he is the one person who's, I guess I read a long article by him.
Yeah.
That was on the foreign policy website or something.
Belying your notion that you don't ever read foreign policy.
I took a little, but you know, to accept the terms on which these articles are written just makes it make you feel like a fool for spending your time reading it. I mean, it's the same. He's just like Thomas Friedman, but not quite as blatantly absurd and not quite as careless. You know, you think through all this stuff, and then you write, and then you come up with terms like, you know, something 2.0 and something 3.0, and how you generalize about what happened before World War II and after World War II, and what happened during this neoliberal era after 1971. You can't accept any of it at face value in terms of describing what is really going on in the world. It's all justifying what's going on in the world so that the rest of us will think that Walter Russell Mead knows what he's talking about, and the rest of us just can't understand it and just aren't smart enough and haven't read as many books, and we just have to listen to what they have to say. So I can't remember what the name I took in getting in touch with Walter Russell Mead. I probably mistakenly gave him the benefit of the doubt as perhaps having something serious to say. Maybe I confused him with somebody else. Maybe I thought because he has three
Anderson
names.
Does the same thing.
He has three names that
Therefore, he's got to be serious.
Be serious. I just don't know. You know, I mean, I think the most important thing for our viewers to understand is that how the more serious these people get, the less serious they could be taken. You know?
And that's why it's so remarkable that someone of Anderson's intellectual gifts, which are considerable, does take them seriously enough and does us the favor of reading this stuff so we don't have to, perhaps. But I think it's what he's doing is very important because this is the discussion that occupies the airwaves, programs on television, considerations of what the government will actually do, by which I mean whom it will kill, and that's important. I'm more and more thinking that one of the most important political events recently was the stoppage of the Obama administration from attacking Syria when it had clearly planned and arranged to and used that as a consideration of its policy such as it is in the Middle East, a linchpin, a central point of its policy in the Middle East. It was stopped from doing that, and I think all of those good Democrats and so forth who tried to say this is what Obama meant to do all along, are really living in a realm of fantasy that's hard to believe. But the fact that he was stopped from doing that and the mechanisms whereby he was stopped from it, including such things as the actions of the British public as well as the American public, this is important. This is a turning point. This is a call for more propaganda. We have to remember that Obama's long suit from the beginning has been to produce an acceptable face on Bushism. Most people realize that there is no substantial difference between the foreign policy followed by George Bush and the foreign policy followed by Barack Obama, that the American government has been quite consistent over the last dozen years, indeed for a good deal longer, and that's what the first article of Anderson's is about. But in that consistency, there was always one catch. The American people had to be brought into the game. The American people had to be handled. The American people had to be mystified about what the American government was doing and was going to continue to do. George Bush wasn't particularly good about that, although he was better than a lot of his critics thought he was, I think. The down-home, just folks approach by a guy who was never as stupid as his critics said, went pretty far that way. But there were still the largest anti-war demonstrations in history during the first Bush administration, or during the first part of George W. Bush's administration. And that represented a danger to which Barack Obama was peculiarly alive. In fact, it turns up already in Obama's early writings when he's clearly doing his audition piece for being president. And in that, Obama put himself forward as someone who could square the American people, who could bring them around, who could produce a quotient of adulteration, in Anderson's phrase, who could sweeten the account of what was really murder abroad. Murder of children, murder of people around the world, a murder program that is in fact far larger than George Bush's murder program ever was. So if that ever breaks down, if Obama ever becomes unable to square the American people, and that means both those people who fancy themselves as intellectuals and pundits, as well as that 80% of the American population that is usually consigned to silence on these matters. If he stops being able to do that, he's in serious trouble indeed. He's not doing the one essential thing that he was set up to do. And Syria looked that way. This was a major turning point. This was important. And so we're in the process, I think, of reconstituting that American mythology. And things like this brilliant account by Perry Anderson of how the mythology is conducted, based on an account of what actually was being done, seems to me to be essentially necessary.
Yeah. I wanted to bring in a few more characters into this play, just to enriching it a little bit. Towards the end of his second of the Concilium story, Anderson brings in some individuals who have a more critical view, or very critical view, of U.S. foreign policy, and have become quite well known for doing so, and that deserves some comment. There are people like the late Chalmers Johnson and Andrew Basovich and a few others, a couple of which, a guy named Charles Lane, who I don't know much about, and a couple of other people that I don't know anything about. So apparently sometimes in throwing out the bathwater, I might have thrown out a couple of babies, although I read Chalmers Johnson. And I think that in contrast to this, what you referred to as a Whiggish view of history, that things are sort of getting better and better, the main theme that some of these people rely upon, which is debatable, is that America is a fallen republic, that these republican values that we established our country on in the late 200 years ago have been sullied by our foreign adventurism. and that we need to sort of get our country back, get our ideals back. So it becomes a kind of problematic way of looking at the world. I think these people have a lot of good critical things to say and see a lot of things clearly about the way the world is working, but I think they establish a kind of motive in a way. They rely on this sort of historical motive that we're this Republican society that was meant to be, basically a society of the people that's kind of gone wrong because of certain other people. And sure, they understand how the systems work, how capitalism works to a certain extent, but I don't agree with this historical view. I don't agree that of a golden Republican age and of a fallen republic since the Civil War, since World War I, since World War II, since Vietnam, since any era. What Anderson is mapping out here is he talks about he sort of begins with Theodore Roosevelt, but he goes back to the Civil War to a certain extent, and what he talks about is continuity. This has been about the development of of the most intensely capitalistic country on earth, obviously because we didn't have a feudal system to build it on, which is sort of pure in that sense. Forget about what's really a free market or not. We'll have to deal with that in some other context. But we have this pure capitalistic system, which beginning with the Spanish-American War at the end of the 1800s, and then especially after World War II, entered the world stage to lead what is this dominant, what has been a more dominant global system has never been seen. So that isn't fallen anything. Okay, so we have to get beyond that to really understand. Andrew Basovich helps us to understand some of the carelessness and hubris. The hubris is a word that Chalmers Johnson uses in the title of one of his books. But we still have to. I still think it's not helpful in understanding what needs to be done, what the problem is, and what needs to be done to accept any idea that America the good has fallen.
That leads into another interesting line of reflection, one that I certainly don't like. But there's the line, and there's a curious coincidence here. There was another book titled Imperium by the right-wing thinker Francis Parker Yockey, published in 1948, The Philosophy of History and Politics, which people keep comparing to Oswald Spengler. And he thinks our decline, he dates it to our opposition to Germany, to the Nazis essentially, right, and refusal to recognize that we should have, in the defense of Western civilization and values, have joined with the Germans and fought the Russians. And so we should have been allies with the Nazis and overcome the communists. And this is a remarkable performance. I mean, there's still some of these people around, apparently. There was a disciple of this point of view, formerly on the University of Illinois classics faculty. You remember who that was? Revelo Oliver?
I got here too late.
Yeah, well, he committed suicide in about 1994, I think. Mm-hmm. But it's a remarkable performance. So if you want to look at something else that is also titled Imperium, look for Yockey, Y-O-C-K-E-Y, published in 1948. He died young, but it's a remarkable bit of pro-Nazi, anti-Semitic theorizing about the refusal of the West to defend its own values and why we're going under because we couldn't summon the courage to dispose of those people, not only the Jews, but the communists and the Eastern hordes who were going to overpower us in the end.
Ron, I don't see why we find this particularly bad. I mean, in some ways, it's an accurate prediction of what happened, isn't it? I mean, if anyone who wrote about the history of the 20th century in a Gibbonian fashion or Toynbee-esque, if you want another way, would notice that what happened in the 20th century, what happened in the Second World War, was that immediately the war was over, the U.S. switched sides. The U.S. had joined Russia in the fight against Germany and eventually Japan. The U.S. Decided that once Russia had won the war in Europe, and remember that is indeed what happened, that it would line up, the U.S. would line up with the former enemies, that is the government of Germany and the government of Japan, over against Russia. How you summarize this book as saying the U.S. needed to ally with the Nazis, as opponents of communism. The denazification in Europe after the Second World War was less vigorous than it could have been, surely, and the government, the government that emerged in Germany, finally, was remarkably continuous with the governments that had gone before. We pretend not in this country because we make, Germany in the 1930s the unparalleled evil, and therefore we must have opposed it. But what actually happened was brought out, and usually this is a lovely example of the poets getting there first. Robert Harris wrote a novel, I think it may have been in the 70s, set in 1964. The novel is set in 1964, in a world in which Germany has survived the Nazi regime had survived the Second World War, and Hitler had died of old age and had been succeeded by the government basically that he put into place. The novel was published in England in the 70s and caused quite a scene. It's a pretty good novel, by the way, but reading like a thriller, But the interesting point was that the picture of the world that he gives in 1964 is pretty accurate, even though it depends upon the premise that Germany won the Second World War. What he's saying is that things wouldn't have turned out much differently if Germany had won the Second World War, because essentially the U.S. switched sides. So here we have this questionable this mythologized reading of what the U.S. did after 1945 and a philosophized account of it amongst most of the people who are in serious positions to write about it in America today.
There's always been this underground story also about the extent to which we welcomed a lot of the top Nazis.
Sure.
The best known case being Werner von Braun because of his technical skills.
Once again, the poets did the best job here. Right, the best account of that is the one you and I are both thinking of. That is
Tom Lehrer.
Tom Lehrer,
right,
yes,
right.
Exactly.
Well, I was going to mention Tom Lehrer also because of this. So this is a perfect time for me to do that because, as we mentioned on this program before, Tom Lehrer said he stopped writing satire when Henry Kissinger was awarded the Nobel Prize. But if
Peace Prize, right?
Peace Prize.
Right.
If it survived,
and he hadn't seen Obama.
Satire did survive, but it was killed again this week, and it was killed again by John McCain saying that Obama shaking hands with Raul Castro was like Hitler, was like Chamberlain and Hitler at Munich, comparing Raul Castro to Hitler and, of course, Obama to Chamberlain. That was from John McCain, who probably would have done the same things if he was elected president as Obama has done. But in any event, satire died again for any number of reasons after that statement, because, of course, it would only be accurate if you reverse the roles of Hitler and Chamberlain and Raul Castro and Obama. Who's the Hitler here? Who's the Chamberlain?
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of ironies that permeate this stuff, I guess. Anderson made it a little clearer for me this kind of phases of American expansionism and leading up to global domination. What I summarized as missionaries, Marines, and merchants. Especially in Asia, we've gone through the stage of sending the gunboats up the rivers in China and so on. But they were preceded by the missionaries who were going to Christianize them, and then followed by the later by the merchants. So the old fashion in imperialism was guns and bombs. The new fashion is buying and selling, and that's how we've accomplished so much of our domination of the world, which is not yet complete and which really seems to bug us endlessly.
These guys are writing about it, right?
I wouldn't want anybody to be intimidated from reading, especially the Imperium account. I mean, it's about as concise and well-flowing, in spite of all the big words that you may have to look up or just skip them, and I don't think you really lose a whole lot.
That's quite right. Good for you.
Anderson is very turgid. I mean, you have to,
but still,
he writes an elegant prose.
But it's elegant, turgid, whatever. Does that mean the same thing? But in any event, it's like I was just thinking. I mean, in terms of, for instance, we've been reminded after the death of Mandela and the whole Cuba business about the Cubans sending troops to defend Angola after the decolonization of Angola from Portugal in the early 1970s, and how the Cubans saved Angola from being taken over and having a different government installed by South Africa, which was, of course, supported by the United States and Israel in doing so. So Perry Anderson does a good account of, in half a page or maybe a whole page, of that particular forgotten until this past week section of the American, relatively obscure section of the American imperialism and global domination since World War II. I mean, there isn't any area of the globe that we haven't dominated in one way or the other, violated in one way or the other, assaulted in one way or the other since World War II. And I'm just going to have to say, during this campaign, I have to be very straightforward about it. I am running on a platform that the rest of the world needs to be protected from us. That's what I'm going to be saying.
That's exactly right.
We'll see how it goes. We'll see how it goes over.
And the fact that you haven't heard this point being made very often by those people who are sitting in universities and think tanks and newspaper column chairs is not an accident. This is the conclusion of Anderson's article, Concilium, that is, advice. To the luxuriance of schemes for the transmogrification of its foes of the foes of the American empire and friends alike corresponds, that's what these writers are doing, a luxuriant set of schemes for that sort of change. To that corresponds the dearth of any significant ideas for the retraction of the empire itself. Not withdrawal, but adjustment is the common bottom line. There's some questions that are outside the limits of allowable debate, right? Of the adjustments underway, and he refers here to things how the empire is actually adjusting itself, further tentacles in Africa, Central Asia, and Australia, assassinations from the air at presidential will, universal surveillance, cyber warfare, little is ever said. That's not part of the discussion. Those who speak of them belong elsewhere. In international politics, Christopher Lane has written, benevolent hegemons are like unicorns. There is no such animal. Hegemons love themselves, but others mistrust and fear them, and for good reason. Close quote. The tradition of foreign policy dissent in the U.S. that he represents is alive and well. Like its counterpart in Imperial Britain of old, it remains, as it has always been, marginal in national debate and invisible in the affairs of state, but no less penetrating for that. It is there that genuine realism, understood not as a stance in interstate relations or a theory about them, but as an ability to look at realities without self-deception and describe them without euphemism, is to be found. The names of Johnson, Basevich, Lane, Kaleo, not to speak of Kolko or Chomsky, are those to honor. The title of Chalmers Johnson's last book, which calls for the closing down of the CIA and the myriad bases of the Pentagon, can stand for the sense of their work and an hour as distant as ever, dismantling the empire. You have been watching News from Neptune, the Quotient of Adulteration edition. If our program has interested you, you might want to look for similar programs here at Urbana Public Television, now not only on cable, but streaming online at urbanapublictelevision.org. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight on News from Neptune have been Ron Szoke and David Green. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com and see our Facebook page as well. I'm happy to receive your comments. Our thanks to you, PTV, especially Jake, Jason, and Caleb, and Jacob. Inshallah, we'll be back next week for a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.